Hello, Edward here from 088. In this session, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about mixing our playbacks. So, programming in lighting states, and then actually when we've got a series of lighting states together, how they interact with each other. Because it's really useful and pretty fundamental for when it comes to actually running our show back. So, what we've got here, I'm running Phantom Zeros. Zeros is the software that runs on all of our Flex range of consoles and some other 088 consoles too. And I'm currently emulating a Flex console on my laptop. That's what the Phantom Zeros software allows me to do. Allows me to emulate any console running Zeros. Top right of my screen, I have got capture visualization software running. So I can, we can see as we go through today, we can see the different lighting states that I'm programming and how they output. So the first thing we'll talk about then, when it comes to mixing, is let's kick things off by talking about intensities. So just brightness channels, literally just brightness channels. So that could be the intensity of moving lights, which is what I've got here. But it could be the intensity of parkans, just generic dimmer channels. It doesn't matter. So we'll start things off just talking about intensity, how it mixes with our playbacks. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and just program a really simple lighting state, which is just literally my first 10 lights up at full. So I'm going to go and chuck those up to full. And when I've done that, I'm going to go and press my record button, and I'm then going to go and tap an empty playback fader. That's our simple process of recording. Now I've done that, I'm going to go and push these faders down. Pull all of these ones down, back to 0. Now in doing that, we've ended up with a load of red zeros. And that's because if you manually control values, manual control values will be displayed in your output window on the console with red intensity percentages. And they're really important because we're going to see our first bit of mixing. If I go and push up my playback fader now that I've just recorded, I stored that onto playback number 3, not a lot happens. And that's because of these red values. And fundamentally what that means is manual values, manual intensity values to be specific, manual intensity values will basically not mix with your playbacks. Manual intensity values will have the highest priority. So as far as the console is concerned, we pulled our channel faders down to 0. That therefore gave our red 0 percentage here. And as far as the console's concerned, it's essentially thinking, right, well, you told me to take these lights to 0. I'm not going to let any playbacks take over that. And that's why these red zeros have the highest priority on our console. Any playbacks that try to control those lights, well, they try to, but the console's saying, no, I've currently been told to have these lights at 0%. That's also where your clear button comes in, because your clear button will have lit up to say, essentially, hey, you've got some manual values, you can go and tap clear to get rid of those. And if I tap the clear button, that will indeed get rid of my red values, and I can now raise my playback, and I now have control of my lights. Rather than having red values, we're now getting blue values. So blue from a cue. That's what we're seeing there. So let's just see that again now. If I go and set my first fixture to 41%, for example, because I did that manually, that has the highest priority on the console. If I now go back to my playback faders, yep, all the other lights, it can control those, but it can't grab control of my first fixture because I went in and controlled that manually, and so it has the highest priority. So we're seeing there how playbacks and manual values can interact with one another. But how about when we go in and start to have multiple playbacks all trying to control the same fixtures? So rather than programmer and playbacks, let's take a look at multiple playbacks. I'm going to go and pull that fader down. I'm going to tap clear to get rid of those manual values. So what I'm going to do is I've got my playback that I programmed here. This time I'm going to go in and program another playback. This time I'm going to use a little bit of syntax. So I could use my channel faders, but I'm going to use syntax. So I'm going to go and say 1 through 10 at 50, enter. And that's going to turn lights 1 through 10 on at 50%. I'm now going to tap record, and I'm going to record that to my 4th playback this time. So I've now got a playback that controls those lights, and at full we've got them recorded at 50%, and I've got another playback that controls those lights at 100%. So we've got this situation, 2 playbacks both trying to control the same set of fixtures. So what's going to happen? Well, I'm sure some of you will be pretty familiar with what's going to happen with this, but let's take a look, let's explore it. By default, intensity will mix HTP, and that stands for highest takes precedence. So basically, whichever playback is on your console that has the highest control percentage for a light is the one that will have control. So I could go and raise my playback that has these lights to 50%, and I can go and raise my other playback and nothing's going to happen. Right now, if I wiggle that playback that controlled those lights at 100%, well, my lights are just staying at 50%. And the reason for that is 50% is currently the highest intensity value for that light. And it's controlled by my playback here. But if I go and continue to raise playback 1, I'll get to 50%. And then this fader takes over. Because it's now taking these fixtures above 50%, well, my original fader is now kind of dead, if you like. It doesn't have control because it doesn't have a high enough percentage. So now my original playback is taking control, and it can take them all the way to full because it has the highest intensity. Equally though, if I now go and lower that down, still the highest, until I get to 50. And now this playback becomes the highest intensity percentage. So that is by default how your intensities will mix. But we've got a few intensity mixing options available to us when it comes to programming in our playbacks. So to access those, we can go into the settings of our playback. To go into the settings of a playback, hold setup and tap the playbacks button. Or alternatively, by default, you can click on the on-screen fader in the faders window. And that will open the playback settings too. One of the options in here is intensity mixing, and that's our row of buttons we're looking at today. Bear in mind, just worth clarifying, this is, as it says, intensity mixing. This option is not affecting anything else for the moment. And as we said, we had it on HTP, highest takes precedence. But this time, I'm going to say latest takes precedence and click OK. Let's take a look at what happens. Again, this fader goes from 0 to 50. This fader goes from 0 to 100. But with that playback up, I'm going to start to raise this fader. And you'll notice that before this fader, as I mentioned, it was kind of dead because it couldn't control those lights because they were being controlled by a playback that had a higher value. But because I've set it to latest takes precedence, this fader can now be used to essentially go from whatever level those lights are at right now to the levels that I've got programmed in that playback. So now I'm pushing a fader up and it's actually taking the lights down to 50% intensity. Because it's now the latest command. It was the latest instruction for those lights. So we don't really care about brightness levels at the moment. We just know that when I raised that fader, that was the latest instruction for that light. And so it then went to the programmed level. So that's what we're seeing, and it's really useful because it means, obviously, I can push that up, and I know that whatever levels my lights are at, because this was the latest fader I raised, they will go to that level. But it's also really useful for intensity effects. Let's take a look at an example of that. I'm going to go in, I'm going to go to my groups, I'm going to double click on that group of lights, the ones we've been using. And this time I'm going to go and say, put a chaser effect on those lights. I'm going to tap record. I'm going to push the next empty playback button. And I'm going to double tap clear. I now have that intensity effect on my fader. Go check out our dedicated sessions on effects if you want to learn more about those. So I've got this fader here, which is flashing these lights on and off between 0 and 100%. I can see that by my blue intensity values. So if I have my fixtures already on at 100 from my playback I programmed earlier, and I then go and raise my intensity effect, again, not a lot happens. The lights are already at 100%, and so my intensity effect is not currently visible. It's kind of running underneath the 100% brightness, if you like. If I start to lower my fader that has those lights at 100, then yeah, I can start to see that effect running, as you can see. The base level, if you like, is controlled by my fader here, but because the top level of that effect, the brightness is being scaled by my fader here, so I can actually start to see it live on stage. But if I want to know that whenever I raise that fader, I can see the intensity effect running, that's definitely a good place to use LTP, latest takes precedence. Because I'm going to dive into the settings, I'm going to say latest, I'm going to click OK, and that means now that even if those lights are already on, I can start to raise my intensity effect, and it will kind of overwrite it, if you like. It's not obviously overwriting, that playback is still there, it's still quite happily in my show file, but this was the latest instruction for the lights, and so it was able to take control. If I lower it back down, we're now back to having whatever playback is the highest control for the brightness of those lights. So let's this time take a look at another option. So I'm going to go into the settings of playback 4, which was my playback with those lights at 50%. And this time we're going to say LTP catch. That's what we're going to look at now. So I'm just going to jump back to HTP to refresh our memories first of what we saw happening. If I've got my fixtures here at 50%, I can bring this playback up here. It gets above 50%. Takes control, I bring it down, and then I go back to having my playback here, having control. This time I'm going to go into the settings of playback 3, my fader that has those lights at 100%. That's what I'm going to go and choose my LTP catch on, and click OK. Let's take a look at what happens. Again, if they're just on their own controlling those lights, nothing has happened to the actual stored values in that playback. This fader has them at 50, this fader has them at 100. But if I've got this playback up, I'm going to raise playback 3. Nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. It gets to 50% and takes control, as we saw previously. But what we saw previously with HTP is if I go and lower that fader, it lowers it, lowers it, lowers it, until another playback then has the highest priority. In this case, playback 4. But now, because this is set to LTP catch, if I now go and lower this fader, well, I can now actually start to take it below the level. It's taken control. I've caught the level, hence that catch word. So I can lower this fader right the way down, because I've now caught the levels. Something to be aware of is if I continue to lower this, lower it, lower it, lower it, all the way out, and bang, the fixtures then snap up to 50. That's because, by default, when you lower a playback fader all the way down, it releases control over your lights. Therefore, we then go back to whichever playback was the highest control. If I want to prevent my catch playback from releasing, so that I can essentially latch these lights out, if you like, I can raise that fader, catch their levels and bring them to 0, I can dive into the settings, raise and lower, and I can then go and say, don't release on lower. I can disable release on lower and click OK. This time, I can grab control of the levels, I can bring them down, and I can actually leave them now at 0. My playback fader here still has control of those lights, even though the fader's down, if that makes sense. And I can then go and regain control with my previous playback by taking that one back down and raising it again. So that is a useful tool to be aware of. I'm just going to dive back into playback 3. I'm going to put it back to defaults, and I'm going to put the release on lower back to enabled, which is also the defaults. You'll notice there was one last option, which is inhibit in our intensity mixing. So I'm going to go and choose that now on my playback 3 and click OK. Notice that when you do that, my on-screen fader level has snapped to full. So my little graph here, my level indicator has snapped to full as soon as I've set that to an inhibit. So I'm going to raise that fader to match. And notice there is clearly no light output on stage, and that's because an inhibit playback doesn't output light itself, but it can be used to, as the name suggests, inhibit the intensity levels of those lights. So if you're coming to this from afresh, you're not familiar with an inhibit fader, your Grandmaster is a global inhibit fader. If that fader is down, if your Grandmaster fader is down, you're not going to get any light output from your console. Well, what I've just created here is essentially a master fader, but just for the lights that I'd recorded in it. So what I mean by that is if I want to be able to push up the intensities of those lights, I must have this fader up. So I could now go and push up my intensity fader, but I can inhibit the level of that playback using my inhibitor. So I can pull those levels down if I want to. I can also do that on my playback that had them at 50%. I can inhibit their levels. I also had a playback here that had other lights in them. I can push that playback up, that has got just a general lighting state of various other fixtures. And I've got my fader here that is inhibiting just lights 1 to 10. So I've got extra control over those particular lights. I've got another playback here that's got an effect running. And again, I can just inhibit the intensity of lights 1 through to 10. So an inhibit fader is really useful. It allows you to get extra control at any point, go and inhibit, control, take down the levels of particular lights. Really useful for house lights. If you wanted to, if you're doing a plotting session and you're going in and programming, it would be very common to have your house lights on throughout the programming session. Well, with the benefit of inhibit, if you wanted to, you could program the house lights into every single cue to help you with plotting, by essentially default have your lights on. But then, whenever you have an inhibit fader that's at 0, those lights cannot come on. They are being inhibited by that particular playback fader. So, lots of applications where that's useful. It's not just inhibiting playbacks, though. It is also inhibiting my channel faders as well. So when you configure a inhibit playback fader, that is going to be inhibiting all light output levels of those fixtures. So it's inhibiting playback intensities and also manual intensities as well. And I've got that on there. So that's a useful one to be aware of. I'm going to double tap clear, and I'm going to take all my faders down. And I'm then going to dive into my playback settings and put that back to default of HTP. So that is our intensity mixing options that we've got available to us. Let's take a look now though at attributes. But so by attributes, I'm specifically talking about all of our fixture controls. So colour, beam, shape and position, for example. Now for attributes, for intensity, as I mentioned, intensity will by default, and as we saw, mix HTP. For attributes, it will be LTP, latest takes precedence. So let's just do a really quick example. Again, I'm going to go to my groups, double click those fixtures we've been using, quite useful to show us what we're up to. I'm going to put them in a red, and I'm going to put them in a centre stage position. That'll do. I'm going to record that to playback number 7. I'm now going to have these fixtures in a fanned position and a blue, and record that as my next playback. And double tap clear. By default, as we saw, my intensities will mix HTP between the two. Remember, I've recorded colour and position, but I also have the intensity on as well. So I do have an intensity stored in these too. If you raise a playback, as you might be familiar with, our lighting state will fade in. So as soon as you raise a fader, the attributes will fade in. And the reason for that is to do with the default fade times on your console. To go and view the fade times that I've got in the queue that I've stored on this playback, press and hold your view button and tap the playbacks button. And I can now see playback 7 in my queue list window, and I can see that colour and position have got a 3-second fade time. That's what I'm seeing. As soon as I raise that fader, that's what I'm seeing, causing those lights to take time to get to the programmed values. I might want to go and get rid of those. So I can go and kind of navigate this like a spreadsheet if you're on the Flex. If you're on a console without a dedicated number pad, you can use your encoder wheels to adjust fade times. Now I've done that, those fixtures will snap when that fader is raised. Now, you might be thinking, well, when does it snap? And that is a very valid question. At what point of me raising that fader does the fader actually tell those, the attributes, the colour and position in this case, to kick in? Well, to find out, go into the settings of that playback. So press and hold setup and tap a playbacks button. Go to raise and lower. And that is to do with your trigger level, which is this field here, your trigger and release level. By default, that is 5%. So that is 5% of the fader's travel. It will then tell that lighting state to kick in. But you can go and adjust that if you want to. A top tip of kind of reasons why you might want to adjust that. If you've got some LED fixtures with quite a poor dimming curve, actually 5% brightness on cheap LED fixtures is quite bright. So if you are programming in LED fixtures, you might want to consider setting your trigger and release level down to kind of more like 1% really. And that will give you then just that little bit of extra control at the bottom end. So that is the percentage at which my fader gets to, and that then causes the lighting state to fade in. In my case, yes, it's still fading in, but it's fading in with a 0-second fade. So we're getting a snap. Equally, when I raise my fader to 5%, or lower, when I lower it, when it gets to 5%, it will then release. It will release control of those lights. Okay. So, what do we mean by releasing? Well, releasing means that playback no longer has control. So by default, the fixtures will go back to their default colour, beam, position, and shape parameters. So in this case here, if I just raise the intensity, as you can see, they've gone back to no colour and no position. So if I lower that, that playback is no longer having control, so they just go back to their default colour, beam, shape and position. You can customise colour, beam, shape and position. Go and check out our controlling fixtures sessions if you are interested in customising defaults. So that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing there. But let's actually start to dive in and mix between these two playbacks now. So I can raise my first playback I programmed, and let's take a look at what happens when I raise my next. When I raise this fader past its trigger level, it becomes the latest instruction for those lights. And when I raise it, we then see the default colour and position fade times take effect. Now, to be honest, my fader is a little bit redundant now, because the intensity, which is what the fader is of course controlling, well, that's being controlled by this playback at the moment, because that has the highest intensity for those lights. If I go and lower this fader, remember that will then release when it gets to its release point, when it gets to that 5%. And then this playback goes back to having control. It goes back to having control because it was the most recent control of that fixture. Let's take a look now. Let's throw in some manual values into the mix. I'm going to double click enter. If you do enter, enter, that will select any lights that are currently on. I'm going to then open my internal touchscreen and I'm going to manually force these to a magenta. If I now go and trigger any of my playbacks here, it then fades from your manual colour to the programmed colour. So I mentioned earlier, intensity, when you have manual intensity values, they have the highest priority and playbacks can't take those over. That's different when it comes to attributes. When it comes to attributes, whether it's a cue or it's a manual change, whatever it is, that will be the most recent instruction for the light. And so it will go there. So I could make these lights red right now. They're going to go red because that was the most recent instruction. However, if I now go and raise my playback fader, they're then going to fade to whatever lighting state I had programmed in there, because that then becomes the most recent instruction for that fixture. So you can mix cues and manual attribute changes together, and they will both mix LTP, latest takes precedence, whichever one was the most recent instruction is the one that's sent to the fixture. So that is what we're seeing there. Now, as well as just raising it and it triggering at the trigger level and it then adhering to the fade times, I can actually force it to scale with my fader. So I mentioned I'm in the scenario here where, well, that fader's kind of not doing a lot because the intensity is being inhibited by this fader at the moment because it's the highest, it takes precedence. Well, I can actually make that fader a little bit more useful to me, because what I can do is I'm going to go into the settings of playback 8, hold setup, tap its button, and I have my fader controls options. This allows me to scale my attributes to my fader. So I can push my fader up and I can essentially crossfade from whatever my fixtures are doing right now, and when I crossfade them, and I can push them all the way up so my playback's at full, and that will then crossfade them to the values that I programmed into that playback. So let's take a look at that now. I'm going to enable fader controls for colour and position and click OK. And this time, rather than the cue fade times controlling the transition, I've actually got the transition on my fader. I can live transition from the current playback to my new playback. I can do that live on my fader. And so I can actually now start to mix, rather than just mixing with kind of fade times by triggering a playback and its fade times running. I can start to do that now with my fader. My fader is not controlling intensity, because the intensity of these lights is being controlled by a playback that has a higher value. So instead I can make that fader more useful to me, and it can now crossfade my colour or position values, as it is in my case here. So that is a really useful thing to be aware of. Now, when it comes to mixing, ultimately what that means is you've got, in my case here, I've got multiple playbacks all controlling the same lights. And for effective mixing, what I always recommend is, as a general rule, don't mix lighting states, mix building blocks. So what I mean by that is it's much easier if you've got some playbacks that control different colours, you've got some playbacks that control different positions, and then you've got maybe an intensity fader for that light. Rather than having a series of different lighting states that all control the colours of those lights and all control the positions of those lights, actually you can just create a load of building blocks. And you can then fade between these different building blocks rather than different whole lighting states. It gives you far more flexibility, and ultimately it gives you far more variation. You can then start to mix your different pre-programmed colours with different pre-programmed positions, rather than having a position with a colour, a different position with another colour, etc. So to give yourself some options in that sense when it comes to mixing, that's kind of what I would suggest. So what I said there is, don't mix lighting states, mix building blocks instead. The last couple of things to mention is, you might be thinking, okay, well, what is getting included in my lighting state? How do I know what gets included in my lighting state? Well, to go in depth on this, I definitely recommend checking out our record options session. But let's take a look at this briefly. If you tap your record button, it will open the record options on the external monitor. If you press and hold record, it will open it on the internal touchscreen. In here, by default, we have a function called Smart Tag enabled. With Smart Tag enabled, basically the console is the one that's deciding what gets included into your cues. The console's doing the work for you. And what it's doing is, if I go and select a colour, for example, well, the console knows that I need to include colour into that cue. So essentially, any changes, if you like, anything that you've changed, that's what will get recorded into your cues by default. But if you wish to, you can start to get much more specific with what does and does not get included in your cues. To do that, you can go into your record options and turn Smart Tag off. And now, what we can do is a process called tagging. Again, check out our record options session for this, but basically it means that now only tagged parameters of a light will get included. And so we can start to be very specific with what parameters are tagged for which playback. So that's something really useful to be aware of. Now, by default, when you move a parameter, so if you move a fixture's encoder, or for example, so if I go to select a light, I move its encoder, notice how when I do that, I get a blue background to those parameters. That means they're tagged. And so that means they're going to get included. So you will notice that as you use the console, parameters you adjust will just naturally tag anyway. And they would then get recorded anyway. But it gives you much finer control of what does and what doesn't get recorded. For example, right now, if I didn't want zoom to get recorded, I could tap it to then make sure that it gets untagged, and with Smart Tag disabled, it then won't be getting recorded into my cue. Turning off Smart Tag, what that also means is you can control fixture values when they're at when they haven't got a manual intensity percentage. Let's take a look at that now. I'm going to go to my groups. I'm going to turn my wash fixtures on. I'm going to record that to my next playback fader. What I'm now going to do is double tap clear and raise that fader. Now, if I record with smart tag off, I will not be storing values from a queue into any queues I program. So that means right now that I can go and grab control of these lights, double tap enter to select those, make them go red. And if I now go and record this with smart tag disabled, I won't be storing intensity, because the intensity has not been tagged manually by me. Instead, the intensity is being controlled by my fader that's here. So I could go and make these red and store red only onto that playback there. To prove it's red only, you can go and view it, press and hold view and tap its button, and you can see there that there is no intensity information. I just have colour. I could now go and do the same but blue, record that to the next playback. I could then go and have, this time I'm going to actually go and double tap clear. This time I'm going to go and put a position, record that to this playback. I'm going to then go and have another position, record it to my next playback. And I'm starting to give myself these building blocks. What shall I do now? I'm going to just do a shift and clear. If you do shift and clear, that leaves your fixtures selected, but gets rid of your manual values. This time I'm just going to literally put zoom to full, and I'm going to have that as another building block. Now I've done that, what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to go to my faders window, and I'm going to work through, and I'm actually going to go and say, well, the colour playbacks, I'm going to have fader controls colour. The position playbacks, I'm going to have fader controls position. And my playback that controls zoom, well, I can actually have fader controls beam for that one. What that now means is, well, I can predefine a colour, predefine a position without my fixtures being on yet, and I can then raise their intensity over the top. I could now go and raise my zoom, so I can manually adjust the zoom. Maybe I want to now crossfade to my other position, takes those lights into the air. And you can start to see I've now got all of these building blocks that I can use, and all of them I've got a fader here that I can adjust. So I can take that fader down, that means I could then kind of live change the colour if you like, and I can raise the intensity again and get them in my new values. Another thing that's really useful to be aware of, when you're starting to have multiple playbacks all controlling the same lights, if you're on the flex, you've got a very useful source button. That gives you a code of where that light is being controlled from. So in this case here, Q number 1 of playback 9. So 9/1 playback/Q. So I know straight away, this playback here is what's controlling the intensity of those lights, for example. So that's just really useful to be aware of. As I said, not available on FlexS, your source button. On FlexS, you're just naturally living in the intensities window to keep things simple. So I hope you found that useful as we've gone through exploring how intensities mix, we've looked at how attributes mix, and kind of putting all of that together really, and how we can actually start to mix different playbacks together to control our fixtures. So I hope you found that useful. If you do have any questions, please do drop us an email to support@088.com and we'll be able to get back to you and help you out with that one. Hope you found that useful. Do check out our other training sessions and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.